Hello, and we have a Monday morning, and I hope you had a lovely half term and enjoyed the beautiful weather. Isn't it fantastic? Snow has gone, which is sad, but we are beginning to see the first signs for spring. But let's get down to what we're going to be learning in English. This term is all about poetry, and poetry is really fun, so we're going to play around with a lot of poetic ideas. So today we are going to find the shape of a poem and we're going to collect ideas for our shared writing. As always, boys and girls, today we're going to think about the ideas, and when we start writing, we write one together, bit by bit each day, thinking about the techniques, and at the very end you do your independent poem. So let's get on. Here we have our model poem, which we're going to work on together, and this is going to show us the techniques that we're going to learn for building our own poem. And this poem is all about being in charge of a school. Let's read it together. If I were in charge of a school, I'd cancel breaks, mind-numbing homework, blunt pencils and missing pen lids. If I were in charge of a school, science would be building a rocket to Mars. There'd be dozens of breaks and guinea pigs would be the essential equipment. If I were in charge of the school, we wouldn't have mean, we wouldn't have late, we wouldn't have we wouldn't have carpet sitting, or finish your work. We wouldn't even have work. If I was in charge of the school, teachers would always tell jokes. We would have art every day, and a person who spends lessons building Lego and eating nothing but puddings for lunch would still be allowed to be in charge of the world or the school. So this is the poem that we're going to look at as we write our own poem together. But today, we're just going to look at the shape of the poem. So let's look at the shape of the poem. The things we need to look for are the title, a stanza or verse. It's a bit blurry on the screen, but a stanza or verse, which we're using this shape for here, is basically each tiny little part of the poem. Okay, so a stanza and a verse are the same thing, a bit like in a song. We've also got something that's really important that in the poem that we're going to write together, and that's called repeated refrain. If you notice, when I was reading the poem, I kept saying the same phrase, if I were in charge, or if I were in charge of the school, if I were in charge of the school, if I were in charge of the school. And we repeated it all the way throughout, coming up with lots of different ideas. So let's look at how each stanza or verse, what we're going to put in it. Well, first of all, we've got what we're going to cancel breaks. And then we had a bit of imagining that we would have guinea pigs as our essential equipment. It's a bit silly, but that's what we can do with poetry. We can be really imaginative and a bit silly. And then we had something where we were thinking quite seriously. We would cancel mean, and we would cancel nasty. We would cancel the things which aren't very nice. And then maybe a bit ludicrous, again, going into imagining. And then the very last verse or stanza is when, if you were actually the leader, what overall would you really do? What rules would you make? So we have the title, what we would cancel, repeated refrain. Then we would repeat again, but we would say what we would get rid of, which is a negative feeling and a ludicrous feeling. Then we would repeat it again, and then we would talk about what we would do if we were the leader. So if you notice at the beginning of each stanza, before each stanza, which is in our box here, we repeat our main phrase, if I were in charge. if I were in charge, if I were in charge, and if I were in charge. And then we go into each section. So let's have a bit of a brainstorm. First of all, let's have a little think. What would you do if you were in charge of a school? I'm sure you've got lots of ideas. What would you come up with? I'm going to show you a few which maybe you have come up with, or maybe you haven't. We would have cake at break. That would be nice, wouldn't it? We would be allowed to talk in assembly. Goodness me, I mean, you really are in charge, so you can really make all the rules. And what about, we would have golden time every day. That would be chaos. Or maybe, finally, we would have the afternoons off and we would only go to school in the mornings. I don't know, I'm sure you could think of hundreds of ideas of what you would do if you were in charge of the school. Jot them down, have a think. And let's see how our shape of the poem works with the poem that we've just read together. So if I were in charge of the school, here is, if I were in charge of the school, that's our repeated refrain. And then we've cancel break. So this is the things that we would get rid of. So it's a bit squiggly what I'm doing there. We would get rid of wet breaks, homework, blunt pencils and missing pen lids. Then we have the imagining. So if I was in charge of the school, repeated refrain, science would be building rockets to Mars and there would be dozens of breaks and guinea pigs would be essential equipment. So those are imagining, those are sort of the wild ideas. Then we've got, if I were in charge of the school, repeated refrain, we would have the things that are negative that we would get rid of, like we wouldn't have mean, we wouldn't have late. We wouldn't have sitting on the carpet, but then we're going to get a little bit silly here, or finishing off your work, and we wouldn't even have work. So as you can see, it built up, it got a little bit more silly as we went on. And then if you were actually the leader, what would you do? So if I were in charge, teachers would always have to tell jokes and there'd be art every day. The person who spends lessons building Lego and eating nothing but puddings for lunch would still be allowed to be in charge of the world. Or in this case, it's actually the school. So if I were in charge, the shape of the poem that we're going to work on. So we're going to start with cancelling, then we're going to imagine, then we're going to get rid of the negative, then we're going to be a little bit silly, and we're going to end with what we would do overall. So today I want you to think of some ideas. Look at the shape of the poem and see what you can and explore some of your ideas that's going to help you when it comes to writing your own poem. We're going to take each part of the poem each day to write our own poem together. So as you can see here, you can first think of 1, 2, up to 3 maybe things that you would cancel if you were in charge. So what would you cancel if you were in charge of the school? Then have a look here. What impossible thing would you make happen? Really use your imaginations. You know, so using guinea pigs as essential equipment, that's a bit out there. It's very imaginative. Can you think of something imaginative that you would want if you were in charge? And in this box here, could you think of some ideas of the things that you would want to have taken away? So let's think of some negative things first of all. The sadness, bullying, anything that you think in a school that you should take away. And maybe something which is a little bit ludicrous as well. For example, in the poem that we've just looked at, it said we wouldn't even have to work. That really would be ludicrous. Maybe we wouldn't even have teachers. Who knows what you're going to come up with? And finally, in your little planning sheet, just for some ideas, I would like you to think about what big changes would you make happen. So what would you want to actually happen if you were in charge of a school? Just come up with a few. Maybe it's no homework. The whole idea comes from this book. This book here, I can't get it on the screen, there you go. If I Were in Charge of the World. This is actually a collection of lots of different poems and by Judith Voist. And her poem here is If I Were in Charge of the World. She's from America, and so her ideas and some of the things you might notice are, I think there's one in here, movies would be a G, which I think would be a PG, parent guidance. So if I were in charge of the world, I'd cancel oatmeal, Monday mornings, allergy shots, and also Sarah Steinberg. If I were in charge of the world, there'd be brighter nightlights, healthier hamsters, and basketball baskets 48 inches lower. If I were in charge of the world, you wouldn't have lonely, you wouldn't have clean, you wouldn't have bedtimes, or don't punch your sister. You wouldn't even have sisters. If I were in charge of the world, a chocolate sundae with whipped cream and nuts would be a vegetable. All 007 movies would be a G, and a person who sometimes forgot to brush their teeth and sometimes forgot to flush would still be allowed to be in charge of the world. Loads of ideas. I'm sure you could come up with so many of your own. We're going to spend the next few days writing a poem together, coming up with ideas, following that shape of the text. And then it will be down to you to write your own independent poem. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Hopefully you would have collected some ideas together that we can put into our shared writing. And until then, have a good evening and goodbye.